G'day, I'm Tim Thompson. Today I'm really privileged. I'm actually standing in front of a massive Kurrajong tree on an ancient songline in front of Charles Massy's house. I'm going to visit with Charles today and find out about how ancient indigenous practices of managing the landscape have combined with modern scientific knowledge of the rhizosphere, the water cycle, mineral cycles and modern breeding techniques to bring about what has been a fundamental change in the way that he manages his property and how he sees a way forward for modern agriculture to continue to look after the land and feed people into the future. Don't forget, if you like this kind of video, hit the little subscribe button, give it a thumbs up, and there's plenty more content like this and more on timthompson.ag. Charles, how are you, mate?
Good, thank you.
Thank you very much for spending your time with us today.
No problem.
Can you give us a little bit of a description as to where we are at the moment? And maybe then we'll start talking about the regenerative practices that have been so critical in getting this property up and going and what the impact that's been for you.
Sure. So this is our family property here, a couple of thousand acres, and it's on the Monaro, which is the opposite to the other side of the mountains, which are just beyond us there to the west. So we don't have a autumn-winter rainfall. We have a dry winter because of the rain shadow effect. So it's only just waking up in our spring. It's about a 22-inch, 550 millimetre rainfall. This property would have been 2/3 covered in native vegetation. The granite, which is a bit over 1/3 grassy woodland, it was once, all over cleared. Where we're standing was part of a thick remnant forest on metamorphic country up on top of the hill. And then the remaining 1/3 is native perennial grasslands, which we've now been, with our rotational grazing, ecological grazing, we have about 500 acres of that under covenant with the New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Trust. As we're seeing our native C4 summer active grasses like kangaroo grass, etc., now starting to really come.
What were some of the problems that you were having? Because you didn't always farm regeneratively, you farmed traditionally for a long period of time. What were some of the problems that you were having with this country?
Well, we had a lot of problems. I mean, you set stock, you get a lot more bare ground, your droughts come quicker, you've got less diversity in your grasslands, less nutrition in the stock at critical times, but for the stock. But the big ones were, in our case, wingless grasshopper attack, which thrive with bare ground and a lack of predators, because what we've done on that bit over 1/3 of our country below us, which was the over-cleared granite, which had no functionality in terms of insect predators like birds and insects. We've now planted 60,000-70,000 trees in sort of what we think are well-designed tree breaks based on good research out of ANU of the existing native plant species, which has now encouraged an enormous amount of insect and bird predators. And we've found that once these grasslands here are ecologically grazed, the bare ground disappears and so your wingless grasshoppers have disappeared. And on top of that, amongst the grasslands, if you go for a drive, spring, summer, autumn, there's virtually a spider's web on every plant. So there's actually millions of predators working in our landscape, which reflects the amount of insects and parasitic wasps and those sorts of guys too. So there's so many win-wins in moving to regenerating a landscape that functions how it co-evolved over millions of years to function. It's no-brainer stuff, which took me quite a few decades of making a lot of mistakes and big drought bills to wake up to.
Just for an idea of where we are at the moment, Charles, how far does your property extend?
Probably goes 3 or 4 k's that way, a couple of k's that way,
yep,
and a couple of k's to the east, and only about half a k that way because we're right on top of the western margin and the bush.
And there's a lot of tree lines on your property and they might seem to be in unusual positions to casual observation, but there's a good reason as to why you've planted tree lines where you have.
Yeah. Where I did my PhD, which was looking at regenerative agriculture, and I'd at ANU, the Fenner School have got some of Australia's best landscape ecologists, and they did work on the central tablelands, which is closer for them, and they really laid down the denominators of how you can reintroduce functionality, ecological pest control, etc., into a landscape, and shade and shelter for livestock as well. If your tree breaks are too narrow, a lot of little insectivorous birds aren't comfortable because there's too much what's called an edge effect for bird predators, hawks and falcons and stuff. So you want at least minimum 20, in our case 25, 30 metres widths, 4 or 5 rows of trees, and we replicate the mixed species that live here.
So you've got different canopy heights all through that.
Different.
You don't just have the one species of tree.
Exactly, yeah. And we will plant minimum 24, 25 or more species, from shrubs right through to 3 or 4 different species at least of eucalypts, wattles.
And you're using plants indigenous to the area as well,
yeah,
and that's
we are.
critical, isn't it?
Yeah, and I know good operators like Richard Weatherly in Western Victoria, who's done extraordinary stuff in tree seeding, and you want that minimum number of 24, 25 species, but you also try and aim for at least a couple of species flowering at every month of the year to feed your migratory birds, and your residents and your insects and stuff. So there's quite a few principles behind not just planting willy-nilly, but doing it with thoughtful design that enhances the ecology. I've learnt the hard way that logically, let's plant on top of the ridge, good protection. But we found if we tuck the trees over the lee side, they're not copping the brunt of the wind and the desiccation, and it's a higher survival rate. And by the time the trees are established, they'll still stick up and give you that 10 times the height, that old formula we know, 10 times the height from wind protection. But just by tucking them over the brow, it does save that drying effect. So that tree break is linking towards the mountains there into a revegetated area that's really regenerating, and then it's coming right back and linking into treed vegetated area behind me, and that keeps linking back to our sort of 400 or 500 acres of solid bush to the south. So it's getting that animal, insect, bird, mammal, reptile flow, that contiguity, because small animals and birds don't like crossing big open spaces. They're too vulnerable to predators, and it's all about continuity, contiguity, linkage, that sort of stuff.
So your tree breaks are not only feeding the birds and the insects that are living in the tree breaks, but they're actually bleeding out into your paddocks. And you've actually got a lot more insects living in the ground, such as nematodes and things like that, which are keeping your grasshopper populations under control? Yeah,
until we really shifted to this system, including the grazing in the early 90s, my father came here right at the start of the Great Depression in 28, and every 7 or 8 years we'd be wiped out with a wingless grasshopper attack. And they exist because of bare ground and lack of predators and things. So once we made the shift in the late 80s into planting more trees, and then that holistic grazing in the early 90s, we haven't had a wingless grasshopper attack, but we know neighbours under traditional management are still copping it. So I couldn't quantify the economic impact of that, but it's huge.
A lot of people will say, oh yeah, it's lovely to do regenerative agriculture, it's lovely to do holistic grazing and everything else, but your productivity declines.
I'd say that's bullshit.
Your stocking rates have gone up, haven't they?
We're running more animals on the same country, even with taking, another 20% of the land out for tree breaks. But that predator control of grasshoppers, moving to, we're one of the pioneers of the SRS merino, which are more highly fertile with a range of other attributes. Our fertility levels, have gone through the roof. And lamb survival with shelter and all those sorts of factors. It's And also our holistic grazing gives us much greater uniformity of the fibre for processing.
Yes.
Because you're not getting that string of sausages look that set stocking tends to give.
Okay.
And so there's multiple benefits we find anyway, and that's without then going into mental health and all those sorts of issues.
So a lot of people will look at pasture like this and they would say, well, I need to plant more ryegrass because I need more protein and things like that. And when we have a look at the pasture here, there'd be more than 80 species in the pasture. There's a lot of broadleafs.
And we're looking at shallow metamorphic hill here.
Yeah.
So it's really crap soil, but with holistic grazing, we're just finding diversities going through the roof. Yeah.
So when I look here, I'm seeing things like dandelion, I'm seeing some thistles, I'm seeing some various other things here mixed in amongst a whole heap of other species. They're not a problem to you, are they?
Yeah, I remember when I first took over the management, which I had to at 22, when my father got sick. Weeds were the demonised, and thistles, you had to go and spray the things. But there's actually nature's correcting tool, and once they've done their job, they just disappear. I don't get hung up about it anymore.
What percentage of native vegetation do you have on the place at the moment, Charles?
I'd say it'd be pushing a third. Some of it's behind us, this sort of thick forest on this quite ancient soils, which is a resource for us in two ways. We get all our firewood out of it because it's coppicing, peppermint, etc. But the biodiversity is fabulous that comes out of it. Not just insect and bird predation, but we have a rich biodiversity here now. We're up to about 148, 49 bird species. We're now getting, because of the huge clearing in the woodlands of and the brigalow country of New South Wales, Queensland, the most endangered tranche of species in Australia are the woodland birds.
Yep.
We're now getting resident, highly at risk bird species that are now turned out to be residents here, which we never had before. So we're getting lovely C4 grasses like your kangaroo, summer active grasses, kangaroo grasses and others now coming.
They've been traditionally seen as lower value grasses because they have a lower protein content than some of the cultivated European grasses, but they actually perform for a longer period of time.
Well, if you're going to have a look at kangaroo grass in summer when it's not dormant,
yep,
it's as good or better than phalaris, and that's the reason why when stock was first introduced into all these regions, and kangaroo grass, most of the landscape from Queensland border to South Australian border, on the eastern half of those Victoria, New South Wales, would have been orange at the end of summer with kangaroo grass. It was the dominant grass. And why did it disappear so quickly? Because it had this broad, green, succulent leaf of high-value protein grass, and the sheep just kept
first thing
coming
they
back.
eat.
First thing, and then re-eat, and
Yep.
it just gave up the ghost. So it's a fabulous grass. And then you've got other C4 grasses a bit similar to it that are part of the mix, and your danthonias and all those guys. So no, our native grasslands are a real stalwart to our grazing system.
And that's touching on a really important part of your management, is that you don't leave your stock on the paddock for too long. Now, a lot of people are familiar with rotational grazing now, but a lot of people are still doing it wrong.
Yeah, they are. I've learnt the hard way.
Yep.
I've made all the mistakes. Really, ideally, if you get your grass to whatever height, you don't want to take it down much below 50%.
Yeah. Okay.
Whereas set stocking, and if I've made a mistake. I've been away, and you can leave stock in because we got big mobs and small paddocks, and so you can take your eye off the ball, and you can go a day too long. If you get down too short, the poor old plant has to use a lot of energy re-establishing root systems and then starting to grow leaves. So,
and of course the C4 plants are slower to recover than the C3.
That's true.
And so you lose them out of your pasture, you end up with the C3s, and then summertime you've got no feed.
Exactly right. Yeah. So it's the secret is high density, short grazings, no more than 2 or 3 days, depending on the paddock size. And then the plants have still got a huge amount of greenery and recovery potential. they're not wasting all their energy trying to re-establish the whole system.
So people that are rotational grazing and leaving their sheep or their cattle in a paddock for a week or more as part of that rotation, they're not really gaining that much benefit apart from maybe some pest control out of that rotational grazing.
That's true, and it's harmful because, as we just discussed with, say, your kangaroo grasses, your succulent grasses, even within that week, the sheep will be coming back, or the cattle having another crack if it's growing season.
So it gets cut, it tries to grow, it gets cut again,
Yeah.
it's weakened, it gets cut again, and then it's gone.
Yeah, I mean, the ideal holistic grazing approach is really high density, quick grazing down to about half or a fraction less,
Yep.
and then move on, and then 3-4 months rest minimum before you come back. And
Yep.
that seems to be the pretty simple principles that drives it to really ecological health.
So how many paddocks would you have here? You've got about 2,000 acres. How many paddocks would you have on the place at the
We've
moment?
got about 90, I guess. We're always subdividing.
Okay.
In the end of every year we'll look at which are the biggest paddocks that can be best managed and divided. So it's always an ongoing process. You know, we'll keep going.
One of the stories in your book, Cry of the Reed Warbler, is about a grazier by the name of Tim. I've forgotten his second name, but Tim Wright. And he was going into town to buy fencing gear while his neighbours were going into town to buy hay.
That's right.
And he'd rather buy fences than buy hay.
Well, that's right. Yeah, he didn't need the hay, and because he kept subdividing and making more feed by better management.
One of the things that I'm fascinated with, Charles, is fences. They not only shape the landscape, they're used to manage the landscape, but they're a reflection of the landscape as well in the way that people fence. And that's why there's no hard and fast rule of the right way to fence, because when you go from one location to another, the way that you fence changes. But your fences have simplified dramatically with your holistic grazing management. Can you talk us through a little bit now about how you've been able to save money on fences even though you're using more?
Sure. I mean, every year as we go to driving the system better, it means subdividing, as we discussed before, the biggest paddocks. I mean, that's the secret of really driving holistic grazing, is getting the right paddock size for your mobs.
Don't buy feed, buy fences.
Yeah, because that makes feed, good fencing, really. And so, therefore, you can't go old style fence for a couple of reasons. They were built bomb-proof because it was for set stocking and the animals were always pushing the fence, so you had to make them really strong, a lot of regular droppers and all the rest of it. With holistic grazing, if the animals get to the stage where they're pushing the fence, you're doing the wrong thing.
Yep.
So, because you're moving them so regularly.
So the fences are more of a guide rather than a barrier.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't got time in this country, with lack of labour and a lot of kangaroos, to have electric fencing everywhere. That's ideal. That's really cheap and you can move it very quickly. But I've got too many other things and there's too many bloody roos anyway. So we've gone to a sort of style of fencing which I did some research, but the best operator I saw was Tim Wright up in New England. Gave me the ideas, so just 7 wires.
7 plain, no barb.
7 plain, no barb.
So no
I mean,
danger to the
barb
native
does
animals?
nothing. I've never seen barb deter an animal. If it wants to get through and get a feed, it's going to go through barb anyway.
Yep.
Just bad for humans, in my view.
Yep.
So all this does is separate the wires. It's a visual barrier, it's a physical barrier. They shouldn't be forcing it because they shouldn't have got the feed down that short. So it makes for really cheap fencing.
So plain wire fence, 7 wires because you're running sheep, and a wire dropper in about what spacing between your stock posts here?
Oh, it's about 5-6 metres, I guess. Yeah, so 3 between the steel posts, as you can see, are a good 30-40 metres apart, and then you've just got these suspending it in between. It's flexible. Stock don't like that.
Yes.
And if a little lamb gets through, he won't be through for long because he wants to get back to mum anyway. So, you know, we find it really cheap and works. If it works, it works.
30 metre spacing and 2 or 3 wire droppers in between.
Yeah, at least 30 metres anyway. Yep.
Fantastic. Now I'm seeing something else over here. You've got some trees that you're planting just off the fence line, on both sides of some fences, but on the one side of this one. These are not, you're not trapped in the native tree only paradigm,
No.
are you? You're looking for plants that work. Talk us through these trees
Yeah,
a little
no,
bit.
you've got to be pragmatic. This is treeless basalt.
Right, so naturally treeless.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's got no shade,
Yep.
and a lot of the Monaro's like that. And we're trying to get every paddock that's treeless basalt with some shade in it. The Quercus genus, oaks, huge variety around the world. There's 600 odd species, a bit like eucalypt, something in the order of that number. And I'm working with a really outstanding fungal expert and probably the best truffle grower in Australia and really knows his oaks, a guy called Peter Marshall up near Braidwood near Canberra.
Mm-hmm.
Has the highest priced truffle breed in the country because he's worked with the best mycologists, the best fungal experts. And he's woken me up to just how good oaks are. Their diversity of species, they're deep rooted, they're really specialists in big taproots.
And they're a fire retardant.
That's a really big one.
Yep.
They're a great fire retardant. He proved that with crowning bushfire coming out of a native park, hit his oak plantation, the fire was extinguished in 150 metres because their canopy's all water. So we're now designing tree breaks around the house, 4 or 5 rows of oaks as our fire protective mechanism. And their leaves are high protein and deep rooted, beautiful shade.
And you're going to get that microbial growth further down into the soil. You're going to bring up nutrients that have been locked away. All of your trace minerals, all of your trace elements that people think they have to buy from an agronomy shop.
Exactly.
You're going to bring them up with the trees.
Yeah, and if you get, we did we planted 5,000 acorns and into a droughty summer, unfortunately, but we did put a microbial mix, which you can buy the right fungi for them. So we see that as a really important thing as we go into a warming climate. And added protection, shade, shelter, the whole box and dice really.
So let's not be racist with our trees. If a tree from another country works, and it works to help manage the landscape, use it.
Absolutely right. Yeah, if it's doing a functional, healthy job, this is a modified landscape anyway, run by alien humans.
Culture that didn't start here.
Didn't start a human culture anyway. So yep, I think it's a wonderful tool.
Now, Charles, this patch of water that we've got here, this is on a key line, and you've planted a number of trees just underneath the key line here.
Correct.
Can you talk me through a little bit about the importance that you place on managing water across the environment?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is tough, dry country. Most precious commodity, not commodity, resource is water. And initially, without these trees on contours, we get a lot of water runoff. You know, you've only got to see the eroded creeks in this country to see what overclearing, set stocking, compacted soils the result. So we initially, before we even started holistic grazing, we knew we had to trap and hold the water in the landscape. So there's a series of contours here going up, done on the keyline principle. I got one of P.A. Yeoman's best proteges to come over from the west and do it, Ron Watkins. And then below the contour, down slope, we planted critical width tree breaks. And so this is a very wet year with us at the moment, and this is rain from about 5 or 6 days ago. It'll disappear soon. It'll soak through, and it's feeding the tree breaks below it.
And you also spoke about the role of the trees with your fertility rates and your lambing rates. Your lambs are surviving a lot better as a result of having the shelter, but also having the really good nutrition around that shelter as well.
That's correct. Yeah, no, we're easterly fall country, which is protected country, with cold weather in spring often. So you've only got to come up here in the morning and see where the afterbirths are, because most ewes lamb from about 4 a.m. to about 7 or 8 a.m. and they're all in under the shelter on those cold nights. And we have a higher fertility level anyway with our SRS sheep, but there's no doubt about it, shelter, particularly if you get an exceptional event at peak lambing. It can be a huge profit driver having good shelter.
Now you run about 2,500 head, is that correct?
Yeah, 2.5 to 3, depending on the season. Yep.
And what's your fertility rate running at, if I can ask?
In our adult ewes, on a normal year, we're getting between 130 and 140%, and that's on joining numbers, not bullshit. Dries out.
Right.
And the maiden's sitting at about 115 or a bit more. So our overall weaning percentage is sort of in the high 120s for the whole place.
So if people are thinking about trees on their property, the number one rule is find your key lines and plant to contours, is that right?
Yeah, well look, get your whole farm map, have a look at what are your most critical issues. Is it erosion? Is it landing shelter, etc., etc.
Now, speaking of native plants, we had an interesting conversation in the car just before. You've noticed that there are some native Queensland grasses springing up, some bluegrass you were talking about.
I know the botanists we work with have seen a bluegrass patch over towards the east and even colder country. And I spoke to the great professor of native grasses at UNE, Whaley, and he gave me a perspective of, even through the ice ages, a 120,000 year perspective, that this climate here would have changed over many years, many decades, centuries. And what we'll be looking to do in some multi-species cover cropping with disc drill is, in addition to stimulating the soil with a diverse number of plant species, chucking in some sort of subtropical grasses like warrego grass, that sort of stuff, with an eye on a warming climate coming at us. We've stopped near this tree break and you're sort of wondering what the hell's going on. We've got a banks here, everyone thinks they're coastal, but we've got a terrific farming family that raises all our tree species for our tree work here, and botanists found that there is a Monaro banksia species way out to the east. So one of the things you can do with getting diversity back into a landscape is have a bit of fun and play around, and so we've now started to plant some of these banksias which play a multifunctional role. We're starting to get black cockatoos now after the mountain bushfires that are using us as a regular circuit, and the more of these things we can put in, the more it's going to encourage that extra bit of diversity. I've driven through a lot of landscapes in Australia, and I don't know how some people can live on over-cleared country, because I just see it as a productivity base to extract dollars from. I mean, we've got to live here day after day after day, and you might as well enjoy and get benefit from the aesthetics as well as everything else. I mean, what's critical in a tough environment like this is the animals that we depend on for our income, sheep and sometimes cattle, have to live in this landscape as well. And we're going into a hotter climate. I saw in a lot of our Monaro country last summer, when we were getting for the first time over 40-degree temperature, animals just hanging around water troughs. So there's an animal welfare benefit, there's a performance benefit just for shade and aesthetics alone, without all the biodiversity benefits of insects and birds and all the rest of it.
Charles, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. Guys, I hope you've enjoyed this sort of video. If you do, please hit the subscribe button, thumbs up, and there's plenty more content on timthompson.ag. Would you be prepared to write me a small blog?
I will in time, not immediately, but yeah, I'm too happy, and look, keep up the good work. This is the sort of stuff that's going to access more and more people.
Well, hopefully we've done a good enough job today that I can come back and annoy you in the future, and maybe some viewers might have some questions that they can put in the comments section, and I can throw those at you from time to time when we get a good one.
No problem.
Thank you so much, Charles. Really appreciate your time.